Hello, fellow teachers. Welcome to this supplemental teaching activities video for Doctrine and Covenants, sections 41 through 44. Remember that the purpose of these videos isn't to focus on commentary and insight so much as to give you ideas, activities, and questions that you might consider using if you're going to teach a Come Follow Me lesson this week. And also, the idea is not to use every slide, every question, every activity, but just to pick and choose the ones that you feel are best suited to the needs of your students and your time frame. With all that being said, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to begin by saying that this week is really, really huge. There's a lot of material in these sections that you could choose to cover. And it's all really, really good. I mean, of course it's good. It's the scriptures we're talking about here. But this week in particular has a lot of unique and powerful things that you could choose from. So it's going to be hard to narrow it down to just one or two lessons. So what I'm going to do here in this video is, one, I'm going to give you a way to introduce and summarize specifically section 42, which I believe is the centerpiece for this week, and probably should be the focus of your teaching this week. Although section 43 is really good too. It's got some important principles that you might also want to consider sharing. Now, I don't know, but I'll give you the introduction and then two focused lesson ideas from section 42, and then a lesson from section 43. There are more ideas in the Insight video that you could choose from. But for here, I decided to just settle in on three major lesson ideas. However, if you do decide to teach something from section 42, I do suggest that you begin with the following historical background and introduction. And I'd strive to make this brief. Just present this information rather than turning it into a big discussion or some kind of interactive activity. Explain that section 41 is the first revelation that Joseph receives in Kirtland, and it serves as kind of an introduction or a trailer to section 42. When Joseph first arrives there in Kirtland, there's some interesting things going on. You've got a group of people that are trying a communal living experiment where everybody is sharing their property and their possessions with each other. And that's not really working very well. You've also got a lot of what we might consider today to be strange Pentecostal type behaviors going on. Speaking in tongues, people jumping up and down in church meetings and running around doing strange things under the influence of what they thought was the Spirit. Now, I'd show them the following quote from Joseph as he describes his experience upon arriving in Kirtland. He says, "The branch of the church in this part of the Lord's vineyard, which had increased to nearly 100 members, were striving to do the will of God, so far as they knew it, though some strange notions and false spirits had crept in among them. With a little caution and some wisdom, I soon assisted the brethren and sisters to overcome them." And I might add there that sometimes we, even in the modern church, give way to strange notions and false things that creep in among us as we strive to do the will of God as far as we know it. Perhaps not in the same way as the members in Kirtland were experiencing, but we too can err. For one, we may begin to allow the ideas and philosophies of the world to creep into our lives and influence our beliefs and behaviors. On the other hand, we could also become too overzealous, even fanatical, extreme in certain things, and close our minds to progress and positive change. So section 42 is going to help us, just as it helps the early saints in Kirtland to stay balanced. It's going to do a couple things for us. One, according to the quote from Joseph, it's going to help correct strange notions and false spirits. Two, it's going to provide us with some caution and wisdom. And then using section 41 for a couple more phrases, it's going to bless us with the greatest of all blessings. What is the greatest of all blessings that the Lord can give us? Verse 3, His law. And that's the nickname for section 42. It's referred to as the law of the church. You can see that in the section heading for section 42. That law is going to help us to know how to govern the church and have all things right before Him. You may also wish to point out from section 41 that it's following God's laws that qualify us as his disciples, as it says in verse 5. And we should be very careful how we hold those laws, as it says in verse 12. Now then, section 42 is going to accomplish those 5 things for us as we study it carefully. Provides us with some of the most basic and fundamental laws of the restored gospel. It's kind of like section 20 in that way. But instead of overarching gospel principles, here it's laws. And this is also like section 20 in terms of its length. You'll quickly notice that section 42 is really big, 93 verses long. So you can't go over it all in one class period. But I do like to give my students at least a brief summary of what those laws are, with an encouragement to cut the chapter up and label it with the following descriptions. The major sections here, the major laws that I see are verses 1 through 10, proclaim the gospel. Verses 11 through 17, teach my word. 18 through 29, obey my commandments. And there are a lot of commandments that are mentioned in those verses. And then one of the biggest ones comes up more than once in the chapter. Verses 30 through 42, and then 53 through 55, and also 70 through 73. Consecrate unto me. 43 through 52, heal the sick and the afflicted. 56 through 69, receive revelation. And then 74 through 93, correct with law. Some instructions there on church discipline. Now, a short pause here to give you a quick game suggestion for the week, if you've got the time and the opportunity to do so. You could use those different segments of section 42 to challenge your students to recognize the laws that God's referring to there. Simple game. And what you're going to do is you post the following posters all around your classroom that display the various laws taught in section 42, along with a few that aren't specifically taught here, to make it more challenging. Divide your students up into 2 to 4 teams and have each send forward a representative. Each representative is given a fly swatter. Right? As the teacher, I begin to read out loud from the various portions of section 43 that I just showed you. The students with the fly swatters then have the task of running to the principle that they feel best matches the message of those verses, and they slap it with their fly swatter. Their team members back at their desks can feel free to shout out and help direct them to the correct match. The catch is, though, that once you've slapped a principle, you're committed to that one. You can't change your mind. And whoever slaps the correct principle first wins a point. Now, if everyone's team representative has chosen the incorrect answer, you give them another chance to slap a different poster until the correct one's been identified. And I'll make the posters available for download if you're interested, but I would recommend that you print them on cardstock, because the fly swatters can kind of rip up the paper if it's just regular paper when they're slapped. And for each round, you choose a different representative from the team so that everybody gets a turn. But now for the lessons. The question for us as teachers here is, which of those sections, which of those laws are we going to emphasize? For me, I'm going to begin with the one that I would probably choose first, since it's unique to this section, and it's emphasized in section 42. And that's the law of consecration. Last week, we studied the foundation for consecration. This week, section 42 is going to teach us how to actually live the law of consecration. For our truth, there's a lot of individual truths and principles that we're going to cover, but if I had to sum it up into one simple statement of truth, this would be it. True discipleship means consecrating all that we have, our time, talents, and possessions, to God, using them humbly and selflessly to bless others and build His kingdom. And I get the fire in the bones for this principle as I realize the power and importance of this particular law. It's one of the covenants that we make in the temple. Pretty important that we understand the covenant that we're making. And it's a very challenging law to live. We live in a world that glorifies wealth, self-interest, and accumulation, especially in the United States. And here we get a chance to fight back against that human tendency and teach our classes a higher law, one that invites us to see all that we have as God's, to consider ourselves as stewards rather than owners of our possessions, and to instill into our character the Christ-like attributes of humility, selflessness, and generosity. The goal here is to seek to inspire our students to desire to live that law fully, willingly, and with joy. There's an object lesson that I like to use to teach consecration, and it involves gathering up the following items. You're going to need 4 glass mason jars, and you're going to draw some lines across the front of those jars at different levels. Then you need a pitcher, and then in the pitcher, a bunch of candy or rice or even water can work to illustrate this. That's something that you fill the jars with. During the course of the lesson, you're going to use those items to demonstrate the steps of consecration. And I'm not going to go into all the details of the object lesson here because you can get that in the Insight video. And the icebreaker involves doing some kind of money magic trick. And I also give you a number of ideas for that in the Insight video. My favorite one is one that's called Scotch and Soda, which involves gaffed coins. And I'm going to give you a link to a set that you could purchase on Amazon if you're interested in it. But I'll also provide you with a link to a video that demonstrates a number of other easier coin tricks that you might try. But regardless of what trick you decide to do, the point of the trick is this. Money has a funny way of playing tricks on people. The adversary has duped and deceived many a person with money. The law of consecration, though, is going to help us to not be deceived by money. I also like to share the following quote from Brigham Young, where he expressed his greatest fear for the members of the church. The worst fear I have about this people is that they will get rich in this country, forget God and his people, wax fat, and kick themselves out of the church and go to hell. This people will stand mobbing, robbing, poverty, and all manner of persecution, and be true. But my greater fear is that they cannot stand well. It's a fun one. The handout that you might use here, it's similar to last week's consecration handout and acts as a kind of companion piece to it. But it just simply allows your students to write in the different truths regarding consecration that are covered here in section 42. And when the lesson's complete, they can place that card into their scriptures for future reference. And for the search activity, you can do one of 2 things. Either invite your students to first read through the identified verses themselves with the handout and seek to identify the 7 truths on their own. Or you could just walk through them together, reading each one as a class, discussing the truths as you go. And the question you ask for each verse would be, what does this verse or these verses teach us about consecration? And I just invite you to watch the Insight video for thoughts, quotes, and discussion questions that could help you to move your classes through those 7 truths. A great little video that you could show if you had the time would be the following one entitled The Law of Consecration. And it features 2 church historians who just have a little conversation back and forth about the law of consecration in the early church. And they also talk about how we continue to apply that law in the modern church. I find it very interesting and informative. Something that you might have them look for as they watch. Ask, how do we live the law of consecration today? Take it to heart question. When have you felt the joy from giving something, time, money, or effort, to bless somebody else? And what did you learn from that experience? I will go and do, from the principles we've learned today, what is one thing you feel the Lord wants you to do now? Takeaway slide reminds us of the foundational covenant we make when we commit to living the law of consecration. And that spirit of willingness to give all that we have to God, that's an essential mindset of a true disciple of Jesus Christ. Remind your students that when we seek to live as stewards, not owners, and when we remember the poor, and that we give humbly and we serve willingly, that we are promised more joy and peace and purpose than we've ever imagined possible. All right, now The other principle that I might choose to cover from section 42 is the principle of teaching God's word. And I may be a little biased in choosing that one because teaching God's word with power is something that I personally feel a deep connection to and a passion for. These few verses from section 42 really contain some powerful principles on gospel teaching. The truth here, if we wish to teach with real power, we must teach with authority from the scriptures, by example, with the Spirit, and in a way that inspires others to act. And for me, it doesn't take any effort at all to get the fire in the bones for this one, because I have come to believe that every single member of this church has been called in some capacity to teach others. We are a church of teachers. And that's whether we do it as missionaries, as ministers, as Sunday school, primary, seminary teachers, as parents, grandparents, speakers in sacrament meeting. We are all going to end up teaching somebody something in this church at some point, and it's probably going to be often. Teaching is a skill that we need to develop if we wish to magnify our discipleship in God's kingdom. It's one of his laws. Teach. These verses in section 42 can help us to do that more effectively. Some objects that you could use to help your students visualize the lesson would be the following objects that we typically associate with teachers. But on the back of each of those objects, you could place a label that displays one of the 5 principles of effective gospel teaching on the back. So I just chose these 5 objects, but you might think of something else. An apple, a piece of chalk, or a whiteboard marker, a ruler, a textbook, and a bell. And as you introduce and discuss each of the 5 principles, you turn the object around, display the label. Our icebreaker is simple. You just ask, who is a teacher that has had a profound impact on your life? And what made them such a great teacher? I use the following handout as a search activity. Since this section is short, I'd first give my students an opportunity to study each of the verses and to try and fill out the handout on their own first. What principles of effective gospel instruction do they see in those verses? And then you can bring them back together and go through each one and discuss what they found. Discussion question: why do you think the Lord is so specific about how we teach the gospel and not just what we teach? A video suggestion is the following that's entitled, Welcome Teachers. And in it, Elder Holland offers some really powerful and uplifting advice for newly called teachers in the church. But you can remind them of the point that we already made in the beginning of the lesson, that we are all teachers in the church. Introduce the video with the following invitation. What specific piece of advice from Elder Holland to teachers stands out most to you? And then a quote, also from Elder Holland, regarding teaching. For each of us to come unto Christ, to keep his commandments and follow his example back to the Father, is surely the highest and holiest purpose of human existence. To help others do that as well, to teach, persuade, and prayerfully lead them to walk that path of redemption also, surely that must be the second most significant task in our lives. Perhaps that is why President David O. McKay once said, no greater responsibility can rest upon any man or woman than to be a teacher of God's children. Take it to heart. Can you think of a time when someone taught with the Spirit and it made a real impact on you? What made it powerful? And I will go and do. Pick one of the teaching with power principles we identified today and make a plan to implement it into your next teaching opportunity. The takeaway slide reminds us to strive to teach with power. And I hope that regardless of what our calling is in the church, that we all seek to become better teachers. It's one of the major reasons I decided to start this channel. It's because I know how challenging teaching can be and how nice it is to get a little help. And I just want to testify here that gospel teaching can be one of the most rewarding, fulfilling, and impactful things we can do in the church and in our lives. So let's get out there and teach with power. All right, our last lesson idea for this week, the 3 voices of God. from section 43. Truth, God speaks to us through the quiet promptings of the Spirit, the clear counsel of his servants, and the unmistakable voice of consequence. Our willingness to hear and heed these voices will determine whether we receive his glory or face his judgments. And the fire in the bones for this section is kindled in my heart when I think of how important it is for all of us to develop the sacred skill of recognizing the voice of God in all of its various forms. And this matters deeply because how we respond to that voice, whether it comes as a gentle whisper, the counsel of his servants, or the thunder of consequence, that's going to determine the kind of relationship we have with him. And our responsibility as teachers here is not just to explain these three voices, but to help our students feel the love and the urgency behind each. An object that you might bring in, a set of earplugs. During the lesson, as you talk about the danger of tuning out the voices of God, you could place the earplugs in your ears as a demonstration of what we sometimes do with the voices of God. Specifically, the first two voices of God. But when the voice of consequence or the voice of nature comes, it doesn't matter how well the earplugs fit into our ears. It's going to be impossible to ignore it. The icebreaker activity, guess that voice. And I've got a link in the video description below that sends you to a YouTube video that quizzes you on a number of different celebrities' voices. Plays a clip from them and then gives you time to try and identify who's speaking. And you could just do a couple of those with your class. And then from the church's website or your own cell phone, play some voices of the apostles from a recent general conference and see if they can recognize some of those voices. To get your students into the scriptures, invite them to see how many times they can find the word voice or voices in the section. Maybe you could even offer a reward for whoever can find the correct answer first. The answer is 15. But then you can explain that throughout the scriptures, there are three major voices that God speaks with that seem to show up over and over again. Introduce them to those three voices using the following three cross-references. You've got the still small voice from section 85, verse 6, the voice of his servants in 124, verse 45, and then the voice of nature or consequence from section 88, verse 90. Take them back to section 43 to search for examples of those three voices. And you could do that with the following handout. It points them to a number of verses in the section, and they're invited to circle the voice that they feel is being portrayed in that verse. Is it the first voice, an example of the second voice, or the third? Or a combination of them? And a discussion question that you might want to ask at some point: which voice do you think the Lord prefers we respond to? A quote that I like to share in conjunction with this section is this following one from C.S. Lewis. And he said, "I believe that if 1,000,000 chances were likely to do good, they would be given." And this quote highlights to me an implication that I get from this section. I'm forever impressed with the patience and the persistence of our Heavenly Father. He tries so many times and in so many ways to reach his children. He speaks often and with various approaches, all with the hope that we will listen and respond. So take it to heart questions. How well do you think you're doing at hearing the still small voice? And how well do you think you're doing at hearing and obeying the voice of his servants? And then I will go and do, what can you do now to avoid the consequences of the third voice? Takeaway slide then urges us to hear him, as our prophet has encouraged us to do in recent years. Encourage your students to tune their ears and hearts to the still small voice before the volume has to rise. If we do that, I'm confident that we will feel peace instead of panic, clarity instead of confusion. And when the Lord calls our name in that final voice, it's going to sound familiar, and we're going to rise with joy to meet him. And that will conclude this supplemental teaching activities video for the week. I really hope it helps you. I hope it gives you inspiration and helps you to teach with the fire in the bones. Thanks for spending this time with me. Now get out there and teach with power.